that the problems of immigration is one way of terrorizing and traumatizing and frustrating the business community on the islands and on mainland, to make sure that the African and the Caribbean will never be caught up in a conversation to talk anything that is progressive, because that business solely remains to be managed by the Americans and the Europeans, and their anger and hatred for each other is now spilled over to the black people amongst themselves. So the problems we see in Africa, in our borders, it is times 10 here, equally terrible here where we are. I was just held for about 2 hours plus on my arrival from Dominican Republic. The real drama that took place was in the Republic of Dominica, and the bigger problem is that of movement of Africans on the continent and outside of the continent. The Europeans and the Americans have their enemies, and they tell some puppet governments around the world that if so-and-so is our enemy, and he must be your enemy also. So you find that countries that are on quarantine on the American and European charts are also on quarantine in most of the Caribbean countries. And the first thing I could say outright, it is that the governments of the Caribbean, though they are black, they are not friendly towards fellow black people. That is the first thing, and I don't blame them. It is the system on which they are working. So the Caribbean is divided into 4 major groups. You have the Portuguese, you have the French, you have the Spaniards, and you have the British. Mm-hmm. So they divided the whole Caribbean amongst themselves. And their enmity, the anger of the British with the French, and the wars of the Spanish with the Portuguese, they end up precipitating themselves amongst the Caribbean people. So language becomes the first barrier. You could just be crossing from one island to another island, and you'd find that the language that they speak there is totally different. Like when I arrived in Republic Dominica, and you find that it's all Spanish thing, so they push me in some custody there for 4 days. No food, no water, no bath, and just making me sleep on a bench for 4 days, literally. And I want to acknowledge that the visa system is a big scam which must be scrapped, particularly when African countries and Caribbean countries are still expecting visas from each other. If an African country is expecting a visa from another African country, you must know that the president of that country is still being controlled by someone else who is not himself. So I used the route away from the Americans and the Europeans to come here, which was through Spain, through Sao Paulo, which is Brazil, and from Brazil into Panama into Kingston. My return was supposed to be on the same route, but the conference finished on Friday, and I was in a hurry to go back home, so the conference felt they could book me a flight from Jamaica, Kingston, into Dominican Republic, and then connect my flight from there, which was going to fly me out into Guarulhos, and from Guarulhos I was going to connect into Sao Paulo. It looked like from the onset there was no problem, because I was on transit. Alas, when I got to Dominican Republic, all hell went loose. They just pulled me off the line and started doing all they could do. I bought 4 tickets. I lost more than 100,000 worth of money. To go and buy a ticket, I go and buy it, and I was on the internet, so I was not even allowed to go outside to the travel agents to buy the things. We were doing it online, and my wife was helping me. I bring the ticket. No, the airline does not want it. Then I learned something very important also, that Copa Airlines, which is an American airline, which services the Caribbean, services the American interest. And if the Americans don't want you on their flight, even if the country you're going to, you have a visa for them, if they don't want you on their flight, they will simply object because you're an African. Because there's no way you can tell me that Copa Airlines can refuse me travel when it's written on paper in black and white that I'm a Zimbabwean and I don't need a visa as long as I'm on transit. and I don't even need a visa because I'm exempted as a country. So why would an airline demand a visa from me, yet the country does not need a visa? So is the country the airline, or the country is the country? These are the issues we need to start talking about, that until Africa begins to look at itself, including the Caribbean, and I'm saying Africa now, I'm even including the Caribbean, that the problems of immigration is one way of terrorizing and traumatizing and frustrating the business community on the islands and on mainland, to make sure that the African and the Caribbean will never be caught up in a conversation to talk anything that is progressive, because that business solely remains to be managed by the Americans and the Europeans, and their anger and hatred for each other is now spilled over to the black people amongst themselves. So I now have applied for a new visa altogether. Oh, I don't need it to go to Brazil, to go to Panama, then I'll board in Sao Paulo and I come back home. But until that happens, I'm still here in Jamaica. So the problems we see in Africa, in our borders, it is times 10 here, equally terrible here where we are.